Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. On today's episode, Dr. Oriana Mastro discusses China's ambitious strategy for power accumulation, which she explores in her new book, Upstart: How China Became a Great Power. Dr. Mastro discusses China's Upstart strategy, Taiwan's strategic importance, the economic and technological advantages China seeks, its rapid military modernization and growing naval power, as well as the possibility of and implications of an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. Oriana Mastro is an American political scientist currently serving as a courtesy assistant professor of political science at Stanford University and center fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a strategic planner at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Mastro, thanks for joining the CDA Institute's Expert Series today. We'll be discussing recent events concerning Taiwan's defense and security, Chinese and Taiwanese military strategies, and cross-strait relations. Could you start by sharing insights from your new book, Upstart, and elaborate on China's Upstart strategy?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So my forthcoming book, Upstart: How China Became a Great Power, looks at the how. A lot of people ask the questions of what does China want? And this one looks at the strategy that China employs to achieve a certain level of power. And in particular, I argue that they are following this Upstart strategy. And this was named after how you think about small companies entering a market that is dominated by big companies. So it was inspired a lot by the business literature. And in political science, the field I'm in, there's this assumption that to become a great power, you should just emulate what other great powers have done, right? It worked for them, so it should work for you too. But if you then think of the business literature and put it in that context, would a small new company try to produce the exact same thing in this exact same way to compete with an established company? That wouldn't work. And for many reasons, that also doesn't work for a rising power. And so what the book does is it goes through this strategy that has three components: emulation, exploitation, and entrepreneurship. So emulation is when a country like China competes in the same way as the established great power. So in this case, the United States. So they compete in the same way in the same area of competition. Exploitation, that term comes from exploiting gaps. That's when China adopts U.S. strategy, but applies it to new areas of competition. And lastly, there's entrepreneurship, China doing things that are very different than how the United States does them. So the book goes through 22 case studies in the economic realm, military realm, and political realm, everything from China's mediation diplomacy to their training of police forces to their nuclear buildup and ways that they protect overseas interests, internationalization of the renminbi. And it describes the Chinese thinking behind why they sometimes choose emulation, sometimes choose exploitation, and sometimes choose entrepreneurship. And this gives us a sense of not only how China has built power over the past 25 years, but the conditions under which that mix of those three E's might change in the future.
Thank you for that great setup, Dr. Mastro. Could you explain the strategic importance of Taiwan to China?
Yeah, so this is part of the Chinese narrative, and it's also part of China's power accumulation. So why Taiwan is important to China, we can start at the most basic fundamental level of why territory is important to countries overall. And there's a lot of debate about this, but the one thing I can say is that the majority of wars are fight over territory. Countries care about their territorial integrity, some for security reasons, right? They need a certain buffer. And this is the case to a degree with Taiwan, that the Chinese feel like having hostile forces on this island only 200 miles from their coast is not great. Also, the civil war that happened in China, in which the communists won in 1949, they feel like they didn't fully consolidate their victory because their opponent, the nationalists, fled to the island of Taiwan and continued to govern that space since 1949. So part of it is territory. Part of it is the legitimacy of the Communist Party at ending the civil war, consolidating their rule. And they have been very clear that they feel like territorial integrity or PRC control over all the territories that they believe are their own. That includes places like Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, and East China Sea is necessary for China to truly have established itself as a great power on par with the United States. And then, of course, I think a second level concern are the economic components. I know it's very popular now to talk about the advanced semiconductors that are made on the island of Taiwan. I just like to point out that China wanted Taiwan before those existed. The United States wanted to defend Taiwan as well before those fabs existed. But of course, there would also be great economic and technological benefits to China controlling that island. And it would also be a key step in undermining the legitimacy of the United States as an external partner, and ideally from the Chinese perspective, successfully pushing the U.S. military out of the region so it could establish itself as the dominant hegemon there in Asia.
Thanks, Ariana. One fascinating aspect of your book is that you consulted over 850 Chinese language sources. Do you think using Chinese language research provides a better understanding of China's thinking in terms of defense, security, and military strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a huge debate among the community. I mean, you have China specialists who just focus on China, who have those language skills. You have more functional area experts that might focus on specific capabilities like the nuclear capability or the economic side who aren't China specialists in and of themselves. The way that I think about it is something that I tell my students here at Stanford when they ask me, is it more important for me to be a better writer, a better briefer, a better policy writer? I say, you know what? It's really great to be great at everything. If you're going to hedge your bets. And when it comes to understanding China, it is absolutely the case that the Chinese language capabilities enable a deeper understanding. And in the case of the book, one of the things I was really interested in was being able to make predictions about China's future that were really founded in empirical data and empirical facts. And so assessing why China chose certain strategies. For example, why China decided not to build an overseas basing network over the past 25 years. That tells you about the conditions under which that strategy would change. So if I look at Chinese strategists, party documents, leadership speeches, and they say, listen, this is a great strategy. The United States has all these bases overseas. They project power overseas. This is something we want, but we don't have the relationships or we don't have the resources. If it's a capabilities question, then we can expect that strategy to change as China gets stronger. However, in that one case, what we find is the main reason for China pursuing a different strategy to protecting its overseas interests, one in which they mainly rely on host nations to protect those interests, and they train those police forces, and a discussion of maybe having those commercial ports being used as logistics hubs for the Chinese military in the future. That kind of different structure, the argument is that the U.S. approach is ineffective, that is costly, and it doesn't work. So because that's the logic, even as China became more powerful, it doesn't make sense that they would want to switch to emulate the United States. And so I find that the Chinese language research is very important. Also, interviews in China, unfortunately, for this book that was written between January of 2021 and September of 2023, there wasn't the opportunity for me to spend the extensive time in China that I usually spend talking to people on the ground. I was there twice this fall, but I find having those conversations are really illuminating. You don't just take what you get. You don't believe everything that you're told, but it does tell you where to point your research and what direction might be the most fruitful.
There's an interesting passage in your book where you describe wargaming a potential conflict scenario in the Taiwan Strait. In 2018, you noted that a series of war games analyzed conflict between China and the U.S. in the Strait, often ending with a U.S. loss. You wrote that the once peerless U.S. military had to adapt to a new reality as China modernized its military in ways that created significant challenges for U.S. forces. Could you elaborate on China's strategy for military modernization and how they address these gaps?
So that example is a discussion of what we refer to as China's A2AD or anti-access area denial strategy. It's China's attempt to purposefully evaluate what the United States relies on to project power and then be able to undermine those nodes. So I put forth this as an example of the exploitation strategy, really identifying those gaps, those vulnerabilities where the United States is not strong and competing directly in those areas. So this is China's ability not to project power itself, right? That's a different type of military capability, but to impact the U.S. abilities to operate. And so during this period of time, what's really important is not only that they focus on developing these particular capabilities, meaning that U.S. vulnerabilities was the primary driver of this exploitation strategy. That's sort of another one of the findings of the book, is looking at the ways that U.S. strategy impacts Chinese strategy. It is the reference point. Doesn't mean they always emulate, but it's the reference point about when to do things similarly, when to do things differently. But it also cost China a lot less, right? Through the mid-2000s, China spent less on its military than the U.S. spent only on its nuclear enterprise. And even to this day, China can spend a lot less than the United States and create significant challenges for U.S. power projection. So a lot of times what this book is trying to lay out is also, how do we think about power? And it is natural. There's a lot of studies that show that when other people do things differently than you tend not to recognize it. And when you do, you underestimate its impact and its value. And I see that we do this a lot with China, that I worry that some people who look at the Chinese military or other capabilities that are different than the United States, it's kind of like taxi companies looking at Uber and saying, but we own more cars. That is true, right? Uber doesn't own a fleet of cars, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those companies are stronger than Uber. And so this is one of those cases where you can look at a lot of peer-to-peer examples, right? U.S. aircraft versus Chinese aircraft. The United States is so much better at air-to-air combat, not only because of our airframes and our maneuverability, but the quality of the pilots. And in simulations, it shows that the United States could shoot down 10 Chinese aircraft for every one they shot down of the United States. But with this exploitation strategy, China doesn't emulate. China doesn't go head on and say, okay, we want to be able to reach that capability. Instead, they've decided, okay, we need to make sure that the United States can't get in the air. If their aircraft can't get in the air, it doesn't matter how much better they are than we are. And so they focus on developing missile capabilities to attack runways of U.S. basing in the region. And so it's kind of that type of competitive mentality that I think, that I hope my readers take away from this book to understand how China has been successful at building power over the past 25 to 30 years.
Just to simplify for the sake of our discussion, there seem to be two main perspectives on a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. One camp believes China is a rational actor and that the logistical difficulties and severe repercussions make an invasion unlikely. The other camp thinks China might invade within the next few years or decade, and we need to consider this as a real possibility. What's your perspective on this debate about whether a Chinese invasion of Taiwan might actually happen?
Well, first, let me lay out why there's a difference of opinion. I think this is important. I myself am much more on the end of this is more likely than not. But I think the reason why there's a difference in debate has to do with the types of wars that we're discussing, the types of scenarios, as well as different understandings of Chinese and U.S. capabilities and what the potential costs would be. So if it were the case that China would have to fight a large-scale war with the United States to win victory over Taiwan, that I think right now is a cost that's too high for the PRC, not only in terms of the casualties that would be involved, but it's hard to envision that China and the United States would have a relationship after, the Chinese had killed thousands of Americans. It's also hard to imagine that there would be any sort of economic relationship, at the very least, between China and the United States, let alone with U.S. allies and partners. So that cost is very high. So some people take any sort of use of force and they say, listen, if China takes Taiwan, they're going to be, this is World War III, and they're going to be an international pariah. The problem is that is not the most likely scenario. And there is one scenario, and only one scenario in particular that I worry about that I think is tempting to China that we have to eliminate if we're going to eliminate the likelihood of war. And that's the quick takeover of Taiwan, right? That China moves against Taiwan. The United States will have, no unambiguous warning. It takes the United States a long time to mobilize. And so China basically does an amphibious assault. The government of Taiwan capitulates all in less than 3 weeks. The war is over. There's no ongoing repression campaign. China and Taiwan are open for business. The expectation there is the United States is not going to declare war on China if no war is currently happening. And I think that's probably right. And that there'd be U.S.-led sanctions for, a handful of years, but they'd be somewhat token to show our unhappiness, but then everything would go back to the way it was before, right? So, of course, logistically, an amphibious assault is complex. That's why China hasn't done it yet. But their whole military modernization over the past 30 years has been focused on this campaign. And I talk about in the book how they went from, being such a backwards military in the 1990s, one in which, the military of Taiwan was much more sophisticated than that of the PRC in the 1990s. But they focused first on getting modern equipment. So 0 to 4% of their equipment was modern in the mid-1990s. Now the majority of it is modern. Then they built up the numbers of it so that now they have more ships than the whole U.S. Navy, even though the U.S. Navy still has greater tonnage. And then they focus on reorganizing the whole military to help them with these, soft modernization things like logistics, command and control. That started under Xi Jinping in 2013. And they're still honing that. So what they're doing is they're exercising to make sure that they're confident that they've got the logistics, the command and control, all that stuff ready to go. So it's not the case. No one on the PLA side and no one like myself who, experts in military planning think this is an easy operation. But the question is, are they confident that they can do it successfully? And after all of these improvements in their military and all the exercising, it is possible in a couple of years they will determine that they can. And so that's really the main concern that I have, that unless the United States can show that in a timely manner that we could respond immediately and deny them that objective, not just sinking a few ships so it hurts, but physically preventing the landing, I think that, China would go for it, because there's no other way that I can foresee, and that I think in talking to the PLA and the party, they can't really foresee either, a path in which the people of Taiwan capitulate fully to CCP rule without any sort of use of force. That seems like an unlikely scenario these days.
The Chinese Navy is now the world's largest, with 325 platforms operating in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Indian Ocean, and expanding its global presence with new military bases. As you note in your book, China also has the largest and most advanced ballistic and cruise missile programs, surpassing even those of the U.S. Could you explain the implications of this significant rise in Chinese naval power for the region and internationally?
Well, I do think we have to go back to how China builds power and what they think are effective ways of building power, because I am pretty concerned about Chinese military hegemony in Asia. I think if you look at Chinese capabilities, behavior, their rhetoric, it is very clear that the Chinese want to dominate Asia militarily. And you already mentioned the South and East China Sea. And by dominating Asia militarily, meaning pushing the U.S. out, making it difficult for the U.S. to project power in Asia, you undermine that U.S. alliance system and what countries can do, whether they can trade, whether they can prosper, will be dependent on the favor of China, right? Because China at any point in that scenario can keep countries from getting, goods and other things. And anyone who says, oh, China wouldn't do that, just look at their record of economic coercion. I mean, when they have the power to do it, they'll do it. So the next time in Australia or anyone says something about Taiwan or says something about another sensitive issue at home that China doesn't like, there could be a lot of pain put on them. But I'm not as concerned about China's global military presence, because they have assessed that foreign military intervention, so this tool that the United States uses of getting directly involved in conflicts all over the world, is not something that they want to do. They think it's costly, it's ineffective, and it's better outside of Asia to rely mainly on political and economic tools. Now, we can have a debate about whether or not they will be successful. Some people say, wouldn't it be great not to have to project military power to protect your vast economic interests? But that's not the history of the world. But, the United States didn't build a colonial empire because Great Britain did. So I think it's perfectly possible that China has developed this unique way of protecting those interests outside of Asia. It doesn't suggest they have less ambition than the United States. It's just that they think, okay, the way the United States does things, it doesn't really work. All those wars that we fight cost a lot of money, and wouldn't it be better to use that money to co-opt elites instead of fighting those wars? So I'm not as concerned about the global military presence. And if I could take it even a step farther, I think if China started projecting power globally, that would make it so much easier for the United States to compete with China militarily. Because one of the big issues right now is they are focused, on these a couple hundred miles from the Chinese coast. This is the only area in the whole world where the United States could possibly not have the advantage vis-a-vis China. If all of a sudden China opened up its aperture and wanted to compete militarily with the United States all over the world, that's a competition the U.S. wins. And so not only am I not concerned about it, but I would actually welcome greater Chinese military presence beyond Asia.
There's a passage in your book that caught my attention. Most have accepted the reality that U.S. policy towards China will become tougher and U.S. attempts to counter China's rise will intensify. But China will continue to minimize friction with the United States and other developed countries, and that should be encouraged. Could you elaborate on this perspective and explain this scenario in more detail?
Yes, so this was in the context of one of the 5 factors that shapes which of those 3 strategies China chooses. So when Chinese strategists and leaders are trying to say, okay, is this an area for emulation, exploitation, or entrepreneurship? I lay out 5 main factors that shape which one they choose. One is their assessment of the effectiveness of the U.S. strategy. Right? Was the U.S. strategy effective? Another one was the efficiency of a particular approach. Right? Will it cost them less? Would they be better at it than the United States? So kind of their competitive advantages. The liabilities of the approach, in particular for party control. There's a lot of strategies the U.S. pursues that China admires, but they'd say there's no way we're going to do that, right? Because it would hurt CCP control. And then, of course, for exploitation, looking at whether or not there are actually gaps that they can exploit. But the 5th one is, what is the U.S.'s most likely interpretation of the behavior? And over 30 years, their consideration of how threatening certain types of behaviors would be did influence whether they pursued certain pathways. So a lot of the emulation that China pursued was because the United States said, listen, if you do this, if you join international institutions, if you participate in peacekeeping operations, if you engage in mediation, help us with North Korean stuff, we will be reassured. And so these were pathways that China said, okay, not only do we get to build power, but we get to reassure the United States, which is useful because the only country that can stop China's rise, again, in the view of Chinese strategists, is the United States. Now, what we've seen recently in the United States is this turn towards a recognition that we are in this strategic competition with China. So in Chinese writings, it's very extensive that they were trying to delay this for as long as possible, but the viewpoint that at some point, inevitably, the United States would find China to be threatening because of its level of power. And so what that passage is alluding to is this idea that maybe now, if you look at Xi Jinping being aggressive, it is uncertain whether or not this factor of a desire not to present itself as threatening to the United States has any power anymore. There is a debate right now in China in which they're like, listen, the United States is going to be competitive with us no matter what. It doesn't matter what we do. So it's possible moving forward that this factor, one of the 5 factors I talk about extensively in the book, will not be as impactful moving forward. But it would be useful, just in case, for the United States to try to continue to encourage that strain of Chinese strategy in which they do try to pursue pathways that are the least problematic for the United States and minimize the friction. And so that's sort of the recommendation of being clear to China that there are pathways that still would reassure the United States, but also being open to the idea that moving forward in Xi Jinping China, that might not have the impact that it had in the past.
Oriana, thanks for joining me again today, and I'd encourage our audience to check out your new book, Upstart. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast, hosted by Joe Varner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next week.